we're moving into a further slice. I would argue just as dramatic a slice as previous ones, in ways more pertinent to our time. We're now talking about the last century and increasingly now in the future. So in a certain sense, what I'm going to be presenting here is conjecture, okay? Except it's also not conjecture. I'll tell you why. I mean, my notion of the place of art, music a subset of art, and culture, is by virtue of the fact that it taps our more germinal intelligences, it's a place that gives voice to the just emerging capabilities of culture as a whole, the just emerging sensibilities of culture as a whole. Okay? So we can look to music through the last century to help us as a window into changes we may be seeing in other dimensions within that definition of art. It certainly has been the case prior to this time in history. Notice we've got a very interesting reality here. We've been moving more and more into form, object, larger context disappearing. If that continues to go, what are our options? Well, we could let go of context entirely, become disembodied, disconnected with community, entirely disconnected with nature. We could just kind of keep on going that way. That's an option. Or we could go, whoa, this has been a mistake. Where's nature? Where's community? Where's our body? We might just sort of collapse the whole thing. Creative systems theory, by analogy to these other periodicities, offers that we have another option. And that is that we may be in a time that's engaging us in a new kind of maturity, that's engaging us in a new ability to hold this larger complexity, to engage in an integrative kind of process, to bring in parts that have been missing, to hold it with a larger whole, to hold it with a larger maturity. Okay, let's play more with that. Creative systems theory argues that transitional integral times happen in any kind of formative process, and they involve an interesting kind of growing up, but in a very particular kind of way. So, growing up and a kind of reconnecting. Reconnecting and moving past at the same time. So, I'm working on this piece of sculpture or I'm writing. What happens at this stage? Well, a lot of times we put our art out in the world at that time, or a little bit later. Okay. But it's also the case that what we might think the art's done, the creative act is done, in fact, it's not even half done. Okay. We've made the object, but art is about a whole lot more than making objects. Art is about making ourselves, and it's about making culture. There's no purpose for art if it's not creating culture. Okay? So what has to happen in that second half of the creative cycle? Well, there's a reconnection into me. Okay, notice what happened in the late axis. I forgot about myself. I was just making the object. Now there becomes the question of, well, so what? Does this object matter? How am I expanded through the act of having made this object? How has it made me more? And it's only to the degree I allow that to happen that there's any object in making further objects. Because otherwise, the next object won't be more than the one that just happened. Okay? So it's a process of reflection, re-engagement, kind of incubation again, being expanded. And frequently, if one's still working on the piece, not only do I expand further, but the work expands further. Okay? There's a maturing integrational process that happens in that. Equally, there's a re-engagement with culture. Okay, what's going to happen with this piece? Is it going to be celebrated? Is it going to be ignored? Okay. How's it going to affect the world I live in? If it's been an effective piece of work, the capacitance of culture will be expanded in some way through its being in the world. And there's a paradox in that. To the degree the capacitance of culture is expanded, the work becomes increasingly ordinary. Because it's what's accepted. Okay? So what happens in the second half of creative process is that this new thing which was once numinous and radical and different, becomes second nature. Isn't that a fascinating term? It now becomes part of a larger expanded whole. And art is only successful art to the degree it can carry through. Okay? It may be interesting, part of that, but it hasn't been art until it has that capacity. How about relationships? Okay, we've gone through the stage of doing a little struggle. We've gone through the stage of being a place where we sort of figure out our roles and work well together. And boy, it's a little easier when you do that. Well, boy, that would seem like it might be the end, huh? Wouldn't that be great? But it isn't too. If you stay there, what starts happening? You start getting bored. You realize that you're kind of taking the other person for granted, and they're taking you for granted. And there's a way you're kind of treating them as an object. You don't see it when you're in the late access stage, okay? But in fact, it's true. And once you move through the creative challenges of the late access stage, that starts moving forefront. You start getting antsy and bothersome and bothered and feel like you're not really being seen. You don't struggle like in the middle place. You're more apt to just go apathetic in relation to the other person, okay? In relation to yourself with the other person. So what do you do in that stage? Well, the creative challenge is to find a new kind of wholeness in oneself in relation to that person. Because part of the late access piece, remember all those romantic looking in the eyes piece that happened with late access culture? You don't realize it, but there's a sense part of what allowed love as romance to happen was a projecting a part of oneself into that other person. And a lot of the bond was that, rather than two people as whole people coming to know each other. Okay. The challenge of the second half of cycle in relationship as a creative cycle is the ability to have a whole person relationship with another person. Now notice again the paradox. It takes a lot more capacitance to do that. It's a lot easier to know your projections than it is to know another person. On the other hand, there couldn't be anything more ordinary. I mean, because now all you've got is two people in the room. It's just what is. And also the most profound thing there could be, the ability to have a real relationship with another person. Now you'll notice I've taught in reading things that I've written, I focus a lot more on the concept of whole person relationship becoming available within culture as a whole, as a function of integral dynamics in culture. Okay? What ends up happening there is that through every stage of an individual relationship, it's overlaid with a challenge to hold relationship from a more whole person place. Okay, I'll come back to that. But it's also the case that within any relationship, separate from that, like a relationship happening in a late access time, there's also an integrative stage that in a somewhat different way, rather than a culturally wide. It isn't a situation that like breaks down gender roles like you see within culture. Okay, you still have gender roles, but you get into a whole person place. And I remember my grandparents in their later years just had they were just wonderfully two separate people engaged in a neat way. I mean, they still did their traditional gender roles, but there was just a wonderful down-home ordinariness about them that you might think these are folks who've been together for a while and came to a neat place. How about in a lifetime? I remember saying that in the late access period of young adulthood, it was the one time that we could say with any conviction that we knew who we were. And that's a bit there in spades. Because midlife times tend to pull the rug out from most every surety we've got. I mean, different people have more a midlife crisis or less, if that term would be appropriate. But however we feel the rapids of that time in our life, if we're really doing the job of midlife, we fundamentally question every aspect of our life. Okay, our work, our identity, our religious or spiritual feelings, our partners, what's worth doing. Okay, part of what's happening is we're facing the reality of limitation, that we can't do everything in our life. We have this onward and upward image in young adulthood. Anything's possible. We transcend limits. Well, guess what? We get hit in the face with ultimate limits. We're going to die. And if you're going to die, then what's the meaning of all those other things? And what kind of choices do you want to make? It becomes a new order of choice. In a sense, truth has always been about meaning, but it becomes about meaning in a fuller sense at this point. It's like the objects tend not to matter that much. I mean, the objects will serve meaning, so it's not like you suddenly go early access and dismiss objects, okay? But the only reason to have an object is somehow it contributes to meaning in the larger sense of one's self. So in a sense, one's moving from truth as idea, belief, and achievement, which is a bit more, that's a simplification, but within young adulthood, to truth increasingly being about perspective, the ability to hold a larger picture. Notice we've got both context and content now in equal balance in a dynamic thing. Piece. And to use a word that's a little tricky to use because of the different ways we use it, but in a sense we move from sort of an age of knowledge or an age of achievement as young adulthood. And in the second half of life, to the degree we're successful, we move into an age of wisdom. I mean, in the best sense of wisdom, that's our task, is meaning, wisdom, relationship in a new kind of mature sense in the second half of life. I mean, many people don't do that. Many people end up living their lives as an increasingly absurd characterization of the first half of life. But the folks who really do their job in the second half of life have a mellowing, a filling out, an ability to hold the larger story of their life in a way we haven't before. We have amnesias for the stages we've moved through just to keep us from falling back into those earlier stages. We move in the second half of life, those amnesias can break down and begin to hold the larger story of our life in a way that we really haven't before. Well, notice what happens with that. Once again, you say, wow, it takes a lot more capacitance to do. That's pretty brave, profound stuff, right? Well, what's the outcome? Well, the outcome is ordinariness. The outcome is saying, I feel like I'm being more fully myself than I've ever done before. And a place that marks itself is that the more you move in the second half of life is you just kind of don't give a shit what other people think. I mean, what reason is there to be anybody but myself? So things in many ways are more complex because now you're much more multi-layered and have all those dimensions in yourself. And it's also a hell of a lot simpler. It's just, okay, I walk down the street, I do what I do, I like what I like, and I hang around the people I like to hang around with. That's not complicated. Okay. And you get increasingly irascible like I do. Which my friends sometimes like and sometimes not. I should say in making these analogies that I've been accused of saying, well, of course you think the whole world is like midlife. You're in midlife. Well, I developed these concepts when I was about 32. So I just wanted to throw that in as a little justification. How about culture? Okay. The age of reason and invention, I mean, the Enlightenment was a notion that we had bring things into the final light of reason and that we had the truth. And the task was only to do final polishing of that truth and with a real sense of human beings and dominion over nature, the intellect separate from the body and captain of the cellular ship that we were in. Very sure picture, very delineatable picture, very rationally definable picture, very conscious and very worldly picture. Guess what? Rug's being pulled out from underneath all of those sureties on all sorts of levels. There's a way in which we could talk about lots of those different uncertainties, whether it's the uncertainty of new physics, whether it's the uncertainty of stepping beyond traditional gender roles, whether it's losing sort of a world of chosen people and evil others, all of that kind of picture. But I think the simplest way to put it is an analogy back to individual life of realizing that what's midlife about? I mean, one of the things that it's about is letting go of parents. Okay. Now, we let go of parents physically a whole long time ago. I mean, it was part of moving into individuality that we left them behind. But we still carry them about. I mean, anybody who does therapy knows that people still carry their parents around. And, depending on your mood, you can idealize them, and by virtue of that, idealize yourself, or you can demonize them and use them as your excuse for all the problems you have in your life. But they're still there in the room, okay? Part of the thing that happens at midlife, if people are doing good work, is that they let go of their parents, mythically. as well as physically. And then, of course, the paradox of that is that in many ways, for the first time, they get to see their parents as people. So the relationships deepen, most often, instead of becoming more distant. And along with it, I would say in culture, we have had a reality in which the cultural psyche has functioned as a mythic parent to we as individuals. I mean, we have this concept of individuality and the concept of being conscious and the captain of this other ship. Okay, but we still within that had a notion of really the culture as parent, defining gender roles, our country right or wrong, parental notion. Okay. So what happens when culture no longer hands us truth? When culture is not the parent telling us how the world works morally, materially? Are we simply thrown into a chaotic world? Are we thrown into a world in which we can create our own realities, whether you're putting that in a New Age term or a constructivist term? Is it the death of civilization? That's been projected out there too. Okay. Creative systems theory says there's another option, as we've talked with all these creative periodicities, and that is we're facing death. We're facing the death of a dream, the death of a parental relationship to culture, a challenge to take a larger responsibility in the story of culture. To be parent not in the sense of upper pole to lower pole, the one who knows against the one who doesn't, but the ability to hold a mature parental relationship with culture and the cultural story in which we're able to take responsibility for the future in culture, in our relationship with nature, in our relationship with each other. And notice again, there's a way in which that demands a hell of a lot of us, but it's also more ordinary. Okay? Instead of seeing being chosen people to the evil other, it's like, no, we're peoples. We're countries, we're neighborhoods, we're communities, we're organizations. And how to hold relationships and hold people and a whole planet, how do we get along? And what do we want to get out of getting along? Okay. Interestingly, in terms of what we're doing today, a piece with that is we have amnesias for the earlier cultural stages. I mean, you could say in the Renaissance, which we have a great focus on Olympian Greece and all of that, that we've had times when we really thought the past was wonderful. And I'd say, no, we haven't. We've had times when we made idealistic, romanticized projections on the past and thought they were wonderful. I think we're only just beginning to actually be able to say, well, what is the internal truth of an early time in culture? And what does it mean to hold that in ourselves and actually embody that? I think that's something we're just beginning to do, and it's part of the purpose of what we've been doing today, is how do we do that, and what are the implications, and what happens in our experience of the world when we do it. Okay? So, again, that's conjecture, that's a radical statement. It's the best shot I can make in terms of what we're up to. And what our cultural challenge is, and what creates meaning in our time. I mean, the creative edge of culture is always what creates meaning. So to a degree, you can be asking the questions and living your life from those questions that are at the culture's creative edge. To that degree, you will experience meaning, and culture itself will experience meaning. And I would argue if there's a crisis in our time, it's a crisis of meaning. Okay? So, back to music. Let's backtread a little bit, because we were out there in integral territory. We've got something that happens before that. Transition up there. Notice, that's a weird stage. There ain't no lower pole. Okay? It's part of what happens in midlife when we go, oh my gosh, I've got all this stuff, which includes ideas, beliefs, family, and I feel empty. Okay? Well, it's part because there's new questions to ask, but it's part because there's no lower pole anymore. And the lower pole is part of what's the context, and it makes things stick together. And if nothing sticks together, nothing makes sense, and it doesn't fit together. Okay. part of what we're playing with in our cultural time, in which we have freedom to do more than we've ever had to do. And as you know, as individuals, you have the material resources to do that. You also don't really have culture telling you what to do. I mean, almost anybody in the room could do almost anything morally, and as long as they weren't really harmful to anybody else, I doubt whether people would be that judgmental about it. Okay, you can do almost anything. You have freedom, individuality, freedom, total. But is there anything you can do that matters? Does it make sense? And that's the question of our time. What does make sense to do? What makes sense to relate? In transition, we can look at music that's transitional culture music. Some fascinating stuff. And what I like to do is an upper pole piece and a lower pole piece, which you know is going to be strange because there's no lower pole, so how do you do lower pole music? But we got plenty of it. I'll tell you how we'll get there. Upper pole music is going to come out of a European art music tradition, okay? But suddenly all the rules are broken. You know, what's late access European art music about? It's the great individualistic composer laying out their concept of beauty. Okay. Transitional culture music throws you in the face of, is there any definition of music, of beauty? And if so, who calls the shots? Okay. But it's going to be strange music because there's no lower pole, right? So here's a piece that is again sort of a benchmark piece. I heard it in the 1960s and was both baffled and blown away by it at that time. It's called In C. It's by Terry Riley. And the way this piece works, a concept you'd not make to say with the music, is it's all written out on a single sheet of paper. I don't remember exactly how many. There's about 20 measures written out on the sheet of paper. You've got an orchestra, and you all start at the beginning, but anybody can play each measure as many times as they want. So like one person could play the first measure and over again for 45 minutes before they move on to the second one. And somebody else could go right through the first. Okay, but you have the whole orchestra doing all of that at the same time. Notice what that starts throwing you into. I mean, it throws you into some of the most eternal of philosophical questions in a new kind of way. I mean, you're tossed in the middle of uncertainty. Well, are you dealing with randomness or chance or synchronicity? And guess what? You're dealing with both. And all, and how do you hold that? And what do you do with that? What makes beauty in that? Okay. Now, it's really transitional stuff. I mean, it's funny as experience. I mean, you sit there and listen to it, and it's like, to me, it lasted about a half hour, and it was so heady, it wasn't music, it was philosophy. Okay. There wasn't anybody in the room snapping their fingers or up dancing. It couldn't have happened. Okay. But it was powerful art in the sense that it threw people into the emerging creative questions of our time. Okay? And it was also good that that particular group was kind enough to only do it for 45 minutes or so. So, here is In C by Terry Riley, and I'll give you much less than 45 minutes. That's interesting. Now, at least if I listen to that, it's pretty boring music, you know. But it's fascinating. I mean, art is defined by the time. It's whether something touches on the creative edge of our time. And it was fascinating to be in that room of people for whom had come out of the notion that art was that music was a statement of truth, a statement of truth and beauty put together by the conductor. So you were there to learn about the conductor's definition of truth. And Terry Riley was saying, you don't get a definition. Make truth out of this. And it just really messed with folks' head. Now, we're at a time now where we're so used to having the rug pulled out all the time. How do we respond to it? Well, we respond to, okay, I get there's lots of questions. Stick your neck out. Tell us what you think is beautiful in spite of that. Okay? But that's changed over a relatively short period of time, which is really interesting. Let me do one more that's also a transitional piece. And this comes from the place of, when I said earlier, well, how do you do transition? There's no lower pole. How do you lower pole transition? There's no lower pole there. Well, if you think about it, we've already come up with the answer to that question. Look to adolescents, because they're going to bring it in from the middle axis part of their life stage. Okay? So, we've got a lot of adolescent music. I mean, part of adolescence, their job within the cultural psyche, they do this with parents too, but part of their job in the cultural psyche is to throw in our face whatever our blindnesses are, whatever we ought to be looking at that we're not looking at. So what do you have? We have skyrocketing teen suicide rates. They're saying, hey, does anything matter? Is there any reason to live into the future? Is that just a terrible thing? I think in many ways it's adolescence having us look at the crisis of meaning that we exist in our time. So this is music that, again, when I first heard it, and I heard it at a concert in which I'd not heard anything recorded before, was pretty amazing and incredibly disturbing stuff to hear. It's much less so now because we're used to having heard punk and grunge and a lot of music that has a kind of nihilistic quality to it, in the best sense of nihilism. And that sort of throws sort of chaos and pain in our face. But boy, it was something to grapple with again. I think later 60s, and it was done when you went. There was they gave out